As you think about, maybe over the next 3 to 5 years as well, what gives you the most concern? Where do you see those potential technological roadblocks, or it doesn't even have to be technological in there? What are those perceived roadblocks that you see?
The number one roadblock, I think, with any new major type of technology is it's crossing the chasm. And if a lot of people who read, there's a book called Crossing the Chasm. So if you've read that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But when you have a fundamentally new type of technology, there are different groups of people, right? Some people are very forward thinking and they're early adopters and they want to try out the latest and greatest things. Then you have a lot of these very conservatively minded people who want to wait until they're almost like the last person who's ever going to switch over. And there are a lot of people like that. And when it comes to the use cases in Physna, we find that like you'd find any other industry. There are people who move very quickly. Some people are like, well, we've always done it this way, even if it's going to mean I'm spending twice as much as I need to on procurement, and I'm going to move 1/5 the speed I can move in engineering. I'm just going to do it the way I've always done it. So the concern that I have is, concern might be the wrong word, but the almost like objection that I have to the way that our culture is set up is that, especially in larger enterprises, it seems like a lot of people are incentivized to not take risks versus taking a risk that pays off in a very big way with it's a calculated risk, not a gamble. And I wish that people would do that faster because the savings are monumental for them. So I think that the concern that I have isn't that it won't happen. It will. It's kind of like when you introduced the car versus the horse and buggy, right? It took decades for people to make that transition. It takes a while at first for people to switch over. I mean, if you remember when the iPhone came out, it took a handful of years before people stopped using flip phones. They were using flip phones years after the iPhone came out, but it slowly and surely went away. And so my concern is how quickly will we be able to see that transition happen?
Gotcha. And as you think about too the business at Physna, what's kind of your chief concerns as you look at and you think about your strategy and executing on that strategy? What are sort of those potential roadblocks that could preclude you from achieving your ultimate goals as a business?
Well, one of the challenges that we have that's core to the company is both a challenge. It's a bittersweet thing. It's a blessing and a curse at the same time. When I started the company about 5 years ago now, the use case that I had was a very, very simple one. It was identifying intellectual property infringement and preventing people from stealing your intellectual property without you being notified and being able to act on it. Since then, we found that the technology we built for that use case actually has a lot more value. We've been approached with hundreds of use cases for this technology. So that's a blessing in the sense that the TAM, the total addressable market for this, is enormous. I mean, it really is mind-blowing how big this could get eventually. The downside of it, the curse of it, if you will, is that focus is extremely hard. And it's not something that you can say, well, just be disciplined and focus on one thing. Because what we found is the use cases are almost inextricably linked together, right? So we've had to figure out, and it's taken a long time to learn this and learn how to do this, but we have to separate use cases from value propositions, right? The value proposition is singular, it's simple, but that doesn't mean that you have to just narrow it down to one use case. We've tried, and what we found was when we only were selling the engineering use case, which is really what the software was, at least the latest version of the software for the past couple of years, we've really focused in on that. We found that software, the same exact tool, could be used by people in procurement and partification, warehousing, et cetera, with virtually no changes to it. It's the exact same interface. What we found was that when we went into a company and we had any degree of success with engineering, they immediately wanted the other use cases. In fact, it became like a snowball effect. If you have the other use cases, you get more out of that one user base too, because they now have more interaction with the software, more value, or extract more value from it themselves. So focus is difficult, and it's not so much. It's not, like I said, it's not so much a discipline thing. Like you can just say, we're going to just not focus on everything else. It's figuring out, how do I change the perception of what an industry is? We're creating an industry here. We have to define what that use case is, and we can't define it based off of, old ways of thinking. Kind of like if using the car example, saying that we're going to focus on like the industries that would have applied to horse and buggy were very different than the industries that you needed to support the car, automobiles. All of a sudden, oil mattered, right? And that never mattered before, but grain mattered a lot when you had horses. Well, grain doesn't matter anymore, but we need oil. And we can't just have oil. We also need to have, finely built mechanical parts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and rubber and all these things that didn't really matter as much in the old age. And so if you can't really say we're going to define it based off of the existing definitions, because there wasn't an industry for automotive. And if you told all the people all the parts you needed for a car, they would say that's very random. You're not focused. But you have to kind of define what that industry is. And that's been a challenge here at the company. And so if anything were to go wrong here, I would say it could be that getting that focus, getting that combination wrong, or not clearly sharing the message on what it is that we do. That could be the downfall. That would be my number one concern. But we made a lot of progress on that front in a very short period of time. So I'm very optimistic about it.
Yeah, well, that's interesting too, and I would think too, and part of that it's resource constraints too, right? So in terms of having all the resources to help you figure out which of those use cases you can capitalize on, and those that you have to pass on, and it's never easy to pass on something as a classic entrepreneur, right? It's all about problem solving. So it's an interesting dynamic for sure. Yeah. How should companies think about using Physna services as part of their overall data strategy and to give them a competitive advantage in the marketplace?
Every company has a little bit different take on, depending on what they're engaging with us on. Like some of them start from the engineering perspective, some from the post-manufacturing side of things. But data is ultimately a large part of this, right? We can extract a lot more data from a 3D model than you can get out of a 2D picture, certainly more than you can get out of text. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, guess how many pictures a 3D model is worth, right? So when your data is traditionally stored in text form, the amount of information that you're missing is it's unbelievable. To put into perspective, to make that more concrete, when we use our machine learning on parts, on 3D models, we're able to make predictions on things like how much parts are going to cost, what materials they should use, how to manufacture them, but also things like how well they'll perform, when you might need to replace something, concerns that you might need to keep an eye out for. And the reason that we can predict that is because it's all a relationship matrix at the end of the day. We know how certain elements of certain models resulted in certain outcomes, right? And we can start to predict over time at a company specific level what those outcomes might be. And we can, really fine tune things. We can do that much faster with 3D than you could ever do with images. It's like a roughly 5 orders of magnitude difference in speed, but then there's also a huge difference in how much you can predict. Like no matter how many pictures you take of something, you'll never be able to predict which part is going to be a problem because of an interior defect, because you'll never see the interior, right? So you can't predict that. But we can predict it because we have 3D data. But even if it was an exterior defect, the amount of data you need from images, the quantity of images that you need of that exact same defect, which you might only have a very limited number of examples for, is overwhelming. You would need, it's not realistic, let's put it that way. It would be able to categorize every type of damage or every type of flaw something might have. When you have 3D data, though, you don't need as many samples. So if you were to send us 5 scans of something with a certain type of flaw, we would very, very reliably be able to predict that kind of flaw for anything else. 5 images of something, and you would barely be scratching the surface. You might need 500,000 images before you could actively predict it at the same level as you could with the 3D model. So the data matters a lot. It gives them a competitive advantage. And what we're finding is that there's been a big push by our customers to not even just use the existing SaaS product, the software as is, but to actually integrate those capabilities into their own software. So one of the fastest growing parts of our company is actually the PaaS approach, the platform as a service. And we're seeing companies buying API access for Physna for things like quality control automation, part identification automation, predicting how parts will turn out based off of scans or 3D designs, 3D search based off of CAD models or off of scans themselves. And we're seeing that happen at a growing rate. So I think it's a very core part of what our company does.